Hello and welcome to the fourth episode of In Case You Missed It, a segment where I briefly go over the most popular releases of last week in movies and TV. It was a big week for new movies. The top 4 movies in the box office this weekend were all new releases from this last week. So naturally, I feel obligated to cover them all. I'm your host, the stud muffin Tom Cruise, and let's dive right into movies. Starting with number 1 in the box office this past weekend is Midway. Released on November 8th, Midway features a main cast of Ed Skrein, Patrick Wilson, Woody Harrelson, Luke Evans, and more, but there's not enough time to cover them all. Directed by Roland Emmerich, who you may recognize as the director of Independence Day, Midway is about the Battle of Midway, a decisive naval battle that took place 6 months after the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor between the United States and Japan. Midway grossed a worldwide total of $17.5 million, and it wasn't released internationally, so it also opened at $17.5 million, finishing number 1 at the box office this last weekend. Midway received a 41% on Rotten Tomatoes, with critics admiring its special effects but criticizing the movie's screenplay, saying that the dialogue is overstuffed with exposition and that there are too many characters. Despite this, I don't think people see this movie for its dialogue. They go to see awesome action sequences and big explosions. There are some movies that rely heavily on plot and others on spectacle, and this is something that I think critics don't get. The special effects and action sequences of Midway are more than enough to make the movie worth watching, despite the plot. Moving on to number 2 in the box office this last weekend, we have Dr. Sleep. Released on November 8th, Dr. Sleep is based off the novel of the same name by Stephen King. Directed by Mike Flanagan, Dr. Sleep features a main cast of Ewan McGregor, who you should recognize as Obi-Wan Kenobi from the Star Wars prequels, Rebecca Ferguson, Kylie Curran, and Cliff Curtis. Dr. Sleep is a sequel to the iconic 1980 film The Shining, set several decades after the events of The Shining. Ewan McGregor plays Dan Torrance, a grown-up version of Danny Torrance, the little boy with psychic powers from The Shining. He's still traumatized by the events of The Shining, but he must now protect a girl with similar powers from a cult known as the True Knot, who want her powers for their own selfish reasons. Dr. Sleep has grossed a worldwide total of $34.1 million, opening to $14.1 million, finishing second in the box office behind Midway. Dr. Sleep received a 75% on Rotten Tomatoes, with critics saying that it forsakes the elemental terror of its predecessor for a more contemplative sequel. Mike Flanagan does an excellent job blending Stephen King and Stanley Kubrick's work, since the Shining movie and book had several differences between them. Flanagan was challenged with adapting Dr. Sleep while also staying consistent with the alterations in The Shining. If you're a fan of The Shining, you should absolutely watch Dr. Sleep. Moving on to number 3 in the box office is Playing with Fire. Released on November 8th, Playing with Fire stars WWE star John Cena, Keegan-Michael Key, John Leguizamo, and Brianna Hildebrand. Playing with Fire is a family comedy directed by Andy Fickman, where a crew of elite smoke-jumping firefighters rescue a trio of kids from a fire and are forced to take care of them until they can find their parents. While they are expert at dealing with fires, they find that taking care of 3 kids may be more difficult than putting out fires. Playing with Fire has grossed a worldwide total of $15.3 million, opening to $12.8 million, finishing number 3 in the box office this weekend. The film received a 23% on Rotten Tomatoes, which I think is a little too harsh. Sure, the plot is a little formulaic. You have a tough guy who is thrust into a father figure role for estranged and misbehaved children. There are dozens of movies that can fit that description. But those movies keep getting made because people who like those stories enjoy them. So forget the critics. Fans of family-friendly comedies such as this, and parents especially, will love this movie. Moving on to TV shows, on November 3rd, HBO premiered its new fantasy series, His Dark Materials. The show features a main cast of Daphne Keane, who you may recognize as Laura from the movie Logan, Archie Barnes, Kit Connor, and Tyler Howitt. And while that's the top billed cast, I'd feel remiss if I didn't also mention James McAvoy, who you probably recognize from a lot of stuff. His Dark Materials is a show based off an epic trilogy of fantasy novels by Philip Pullman. Now I know what you're thinking. Here we go again with HBO adapting a series of fantasy novels. Well, I have good news for you. Philip Pullman has already finished the trilogy of books the show is based off of, so the show certainly won't have any disasters like the ending of Game of Thrones. The premise of the story is that of an alternative world where all humans have animal companions called daemons. In this world, magic, science, and theology are all intertwined. Lyra, the protagonist, is an orphan who lives with scholars at Jordan College in Oxford. The story begins as she is searching for her missing friend and discovers a sinister mystery. His Dark Materials has a 79% on Rotten Tomatoes, with critics praising its visual splendor and exceptional performances, but saying that it could use a little more magic. Personally, I think this show will be fantastic. HBO is usually a slam dunk for TV shows, as their standard for TV shows are almost at their own format, somewhere between the big and little screens. It's already been renewed for a second season, so if you're a fan of epic fantasy stories, you should absolutely give this one a watch. Last but not least, the other TV show I want to cover this week is Back to Life. While it already premiered overseas on April 15th, the show premiered in the United States on Showtime TV on November 10th. Back to Life is a British comedy drama starring Daisy Haggard, Geraldine James, Richard Duran, and Liam Williams. The show follows Mary Madison as she returns to her normal life in the small English coastal town of Hythe, Kent, after serving an 18-year jail sentence for murder. While rebuilding her life, she befriends Billy, a nice man who is taking care of her elderly neighbor next door. The series does a good job of focusing on Miri as she struggles to come to terms with her past while also attempting to rebuild her present, which is made ever more difficult by the fact that the people of her town ostracize her for being a murderer, though her disposition makes it hard to believe she could have done such a thing. The series has a 100% on Rotten Tomatoes so far, though with only 19 reviews, so take that with a grain of salt. Ultimately, I find it easy to empathize with the main character because we've all done things that we regret, and sometimes it can be difficult to move on from them even after we've learned lessons from those mistakes. I think this show will give you some thoughts to contemplate in between the laughs it provides, so be sure to check it out on Showtime TV. Before we close out the show, here are some notable returning shows from last week. Rick and Morty, Season 4, Shameless, Season 10, She-Ra and the Princesses of Power, Season 4, and Little Things, Season 3. If you're a fan of those shows, they returned last week, so be sure that you don't miss them. That'll do it for this week's segment of In Case You Missed It. Be sure to tune in next week to catch up on all the popular releases of this week. And there should be a lot because Disney Plus is coming out tomorrow. Until then, I'm your host, the Stud Muffin Tom Cruise, and keep it locked. It's a good night.